So I've got 20 minutes, is that what you say?
Yeah, and I will be flashing signs at you.
I'm just going to use this as my Julia Roberts at the Oscars moment and just keep going. So, louder? Okay.
Shall we put this on you?
No, that's okay. I'll use my I'll use my lecture hall voice. All right.
And I also note that there's a gendered aspect to the length of talks, and I'm watching you.
Okay.
Okay.
I don't know how to take that, but that's all right. Okay.
You will.
I just got to reset this. There we go. In recent years, reconciliation has attained national prominence as the federal government seeks to repair its damaged relationship with Indigenous peoples. In turn, provincial and local governments have come to embrace reconciliation, including the province of Alberta and Lethbridge and Calgary, respectively. In Canada, as this slide illustrates, in the last 4 years, there has been more than 340 media references to specific program initiatives. These stories and the associated programs suggest that reconciliation is deemed an effective means of moving forward in a socially sustainable fashion. In such cases, emphasis is placed on looking backwards in time to the point where the relationship was fractured or destabilized. It is thus necessary to dedicate both suitable consideration to identifying the ideological anchors of the initial mistreatment and the resources needed to remedy the situation. The resultant understanding of history through counter-narrative informs the construction of benchmarks to betterment, which acts as a political roadmap aiding with our social constitution. This approach resonates well with urban social sustainability's emphasis on equity and social justice, themes that by the early 2010s were evident in both Calgary and Lethbridge municipal discussions concerning the need to accommodate Indigenous peoples. Many officials likewise openly supported relationship building as a means of improving Indigenous municipal outcomes, even if they'd been unable to make any progress in this regard. Noticeably, this breakdown occurred during a period of substantial national municipal Indigenous interface. Between 2010 and 2014, as an example, more than 330 municipal First Nations agreements were signed nationally. Notably, Alberta is near the bottom of the list with only 7 agreements, suggesting a provincial resistance. Media reports suggested, however, that provincial municipal leaders were seeking to develop new ways of working with First Nations and Indigenous peoples. If this indeed was the case, the question then became, what were the barriers that kept the favored relationships from developing? So between 2014 and 2015, I initiated one research project in 2 sites with Kate DeCryfe, my grad student at the time, and Ryan Walker, who's a professor at the University of Saskatchewan and an alumni from the University of Lethbridge. What we did is we interviewed 4 counselors and the mayor here in Lethbridge, and 6 city councillors and the mayor in Calgary. Since I can't keep the anonymity of the mayor of Calgary at this stage of the game, we'll just say it was Nenshi. So when I say the mayor of Calgary, you know who it is. We did person-centered interviews and repeated interviews if we had to go back, and ultimately we coded all the transcripts in vivo 10. We're at in vivo 12. It just shows you how far we've progressed in the last couple of years. The 2 sites, specifically within Niitsitapi territory, Treaty 7, which was signed in 1877 September, are Lethbridge and Calgary. One is a large metropolitan center, the other is a small municipality, a small town. Either way, what we have is, at the time, about 93,000 people in Lethbridge, of which the Indigenous population made up about 15%. In Calgary, it's about 35,000 out of 1.24 million population, which is about 2.84%. We identified Lethbridge as having a growing urbanized and urbanizing population. It's urbanized and urbanizing in Calgary, but not to the same extent. And what we did is we just identified some basic characteristics from which to jumpstart the research. What we found in each community was that we were dealing with a 3rd generation of urban Indigenous population. We saw no Indigenous city council members at that point in time. In both cities, there was a limited Indigenous political visibility, which really will come into play down the line. At the same time, there was what we call an Aboriginal infrastructure, an invisible Aboriginal infrastructure with limited evident interface with city council members, and then ultimately there was a negligible economic presence. So there was some overlap, but we did know that we were going into 2 separate cities at that point in time, so that was important to at least get established very early on. But prior to diving into the analysis, It's important to note that at this point there was an uptick in claims of what's been identified as municipal colonialism. Most noteworthy was the February 2015 Maclean's cover story exposing Canada's municipal Indigenous racism dilemma, with Winnipeg presented as a symbol of these concerns. Without delay, the national media focused its investigative lens on municipal colonialism, described here as a city planning approach that systematically denies Indigenous social, economic, and political claims to the city. Notably, we anticipated this project as an opportunity to place contours of meaning on the concept of municipal colonialism. Upon entering the field and initiating interviews, it was immediately apparent that municipal officials appeared to be using the word reconciliation to describe co-production of policy. This is an approach to municipal Aboriginal policy engagement that seeks to increase Aboriginal participation in local policymaking and planning processes. Notably, it does not presuppose equality of partners. When we noticed this tension to the participants, officials repeatedly responded by asking us for clarification regarding the nature of Indigenous self-determination, which they conflated with self-government. We assume that this is because political agents were being assigned greater legitimacy in comparison to urban Indigenous residents. In any case, the participants were asking for more information about indigeneity. This is what we define as a broad political and cultural project to assert Indigenous ways of life and the basic right of self-determination in the way we understand discourse and materiality in Canada generally and in the prairie cities specifically. When our participants, who ostensibly were seeking reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, began asking us what it was that they wanted, the Indigenous population, we knew we were onto something interesting. We then had to turn the question back on them to get them to reflect on the process of reconciliation, which demands that the actors set the stage for deliberation and improve social well-being. Reconciliation seeks to ensure we humanize subjects rather than simply examining institutions or haphazardly responding to grievances. What we sought to determine was how municipal officials were constructing indigeneity and how their potential Indigenous partners in reconciliation were being characterized. Despite professing a desire to pursue reconciliation, municipal officials also frequently balked at trying to establish relationships due to a lack of understanding of urban Indigenous self-determination as an institution, and Indigenous peoples' municipal status as residents. The latter issue is somewhat confusing when we consider that urban Indigenous peoples are municipal citizens in the same way that non-Indigenous peoples are. Self-determination claims in this setting are also deemed an overt challenge to municipal histories that continue to reject urban Indigenous compatibility. Indigenous claims reinforce municipal attitudes equating Indigenous peoples as a problem. These attitudes are not surprising when we reflect on our regional mythology. The late 19th century frontier was characterized by American and Canadian whiskey traders, drunken Indians, and Canadian or British heroes who defended law and order. Good overcame evil as the whiskey trade was stamped out, Indians were sequestered onto reserves, and civilization took hold with the introduction of coal mining, railways, and agriculture. In colonial narratives, Indigenous peoples were effaced as nameless and faceless warriors, whose homelands were recast as terra nullius sites of nomadic foraging. Banished to the margins by treaties, which ceded their lands to Canada, regional Indians played into official and popular histories as dysfunctional and violent, simply victims to be forgotten. Reconciliation in this setting, therefore, may seem counterintuitive to municipal officials. Building on these themes, local officials adamantly asserted that authentic Indigenous identities and self-determination rights were nested within First Nations communities and thus non-transferable to the city. These conclusions challenge several Supreme Court of Canada decisions classifying urban Indigenous peoples as unique political communities whose residents may retain First Nations memberships. Indigenous claims to self-determination or self-government were likewise dismissed because municipal citizens cannot be considered self-determining outside of the Municipal Government Act strictures or Canadian law. As non-citizens with dubious self-determination claims, municipal officials chip away at indigeneity's integrity by proclaiming Indigenous peoples to be stakeholders, not rights holders. This, of course, undermines constitutional recognition of Aboriginal rights and self-government, the inherent right to self-government policy of 1995, and the government's endorsement of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2010. The message was becoming clear. Urban Indigenous peoples cannot be considered political partners, even though municipal officials appear willing to engage Indigenous peoples as such. This reflects the literature that consistently reinforces a Canadian belief in urban Indigenous incommensurability. Reconciliation thus emerged as a way of managing stakeholder engagement as opposed to establishing frameworks to reconstitute society based on equity and equality. Although municipal leaders agreed that there was a need to build inclusive cities and sustainable neighborhoods, most were unable or unwilling to formulate alternative programs to help elevate Indigenous populations. Their apprehension was driven by local concerns that municipal Indigenous engagement could be misinterpreted as the City Council privileging one ethnocultural group over mainstream Canadians. For example, during the interviews, the idea of race-based rights and special privileges generated markedly negative responses from city councillors. This led to a hypothesis that drove municipal response strategies. If Indigenous peoples are indeed municipal citizens, they are not entitled to special rights. Yet local officials simultaneously portrayed urban Indigenous peoples as municipal outsiders and not citizens. Urban Indigenous populations are therefore erratically portrayed as members of self-governing First Nations, band members living in the city. As members of non-citizen special interest groups federal officials retain exclusive responsibility for, or as citizens with the same rights and privileges afforded all other Canadians. Each approach, by the way, systematically undermines Indigenous claims to a right to the city. Finally, and this was expressed most overtly in Lethbridge, pathology emerges as an identity marker that municipal officials simultaneously construct and deploy to convey why Indigenous peoples live in the city when they have a reserve to call home. This was a familiar refrain utilized to signify political frustration with Indigenous complainants, for it was Indigenous peoples demonstrating atypical behaviors in the first place, which resulted in and perpetuated nomadic activities. Note that these are the same beliefs that led federal officials to implement a civilization policy in the 1860s that paved the way for residential schools. We endeavored to generate a set of recommendations for change and asked each participant how to best facilitate Indigenous municipal reconciliation, and three general themes emerged from the data sets. First, improved visibility was required prior to council members taking Indigenous concerns more seriously. Indigenous peoples, therefore, must take responsibility for improving their political and economic prospects. I didn't want to use neoliberalism today, but that's what we're starting to get at. Two, until more formally institutionally visible, municipal Indigenous interaction is not suggested due to the fact that non-Indigenous populations could perceive this as official privileging of a culture group through the municipality pursuing race-based rights. And in three, assimilation is considered to be key to heightening social visibility, even if the word assimilation was never spoken outright. This means that urban Aboriginal peoples must remain band members living in the city or become municipal citizens of Aboriginal descent. In both cases, the onus for improved relations rests with the Indigenous community exclusively. The interview participants indicated that attending city council meetings, joining local committees, or airing or otherwise presenting grievances to city officials could help resolve these tensions. To do otherwise would denote a lack of interest in local government and improve local well-being. In particular, committee participation in city and other public sector endeavors was promoted as the key opportunity to become grounded in local political and business operations, which leaders envisioned as the way to refashion the other in their image. Municipal leaders in both Calgary and Lethbridge seek to improve social sustainability by reconciling with their respective urban Indigenous communities and orbiting First Nations. Among the key criteria of socially sustainable communities, specifically points 1, 2, 3, and 4, it is clear that the strength of municipal Indigenous social frameworks or networks is weak. There are linkages evident amongst the various Indigenous organizations, reflecting David Newhouse's discussion about the existence and value of an invisible infrastructure of said organizations to improve urban Indigenous social capital. But these groups tend to remain segregated from the circuits of power and, as demonstrated, are consequently less influential. In terms of participating in planning processes, the third point, there's inadequate engagement over what I'd call the big ticket items. Reconciliation in both communities has come to rely on symbolic gestures or incomplete models rather than substantive approaches. This is a positive step forward, but one that demands greater attention. Now this takes us to point 4. In 2010, a majority of Indigenous respondents to the Urban Aboriginal Peoples Strategy indicated that they gain much satisfaction from city life. They consider the city to be home. They're proud of their identity. They are seeking to become a more visible part of the urban landscape and make it better suited to their lives. Municipal leaders in either city have yet to capitalize on these trends. It appears that producing social sustainability is not possible until several issues are put right. First, I got to get this right. Contemporaneous municipal attitudes about indigeneity ignore or overlook the fluidity of exogenously constructed urban indigenous identity markers that are employed to help divest the cityscape of the pathological Indian and that are used to educate the growing permanent population in proper social protocols. At a fundamental level, municipal officials are asking indigenous peoples to abandon their right to self-government and to become good urban indigenous citizens. Pursuing self-government is considered a foolhardy venture for non-indigenous respondents now occupy and own former indigenous lands. Aboriginal title was extinguished vis-a-vis treaty, surrender, or other legal means. Finally, when we asked whether racism and discrimination directed at urban indigenous peoples could be influencing these trends, we were informed that it was not racism per se, but a rational response of productive citizens upset by those who consciously choose to live off of society's largesse. Of all the study's problematic findings, perhaps the most troubling is that municipal officials continue to ignore indigenous peoples in real time, and they rely on Indian as a social construct to guide their decision making. The combination of our regional and national mythology, our ongoing reliance on a social construct known as the Indian, and reinforcing power relations rooted in beliefs of cultural superiority animates what Stanger Ross termed municipal colonialism. But what are the markers of municipal colonialism? The first one that we've identified is a lack of knowledge of regional pre-contact and post-contact history. When you think back to the mythology that I just presented, we still rely on that to present ourselves as new to the territory, bringers of life to the desert, and so on and so forth. Acting on a lack of political knowledge of Canadian Indian policy. This was most pronounced when municipal officials cited jurisdictional concerns to note that they did not have to recognize Indians as citizens because they were a federal responsibility. Overt challenges to or denial of Supreme Court of Canada decisions and federal policies. Urban Aboriginal self-determination has been recognized by the courts. Aboriginal self-government is a policy, and so on. Belief in urban Indigenous incommensurability. This one came through loud and clear regularly. Indigenous peoples do not belong in the city, nor can they thrive in urban environments. Unilaterally categorizing Indigenous peoples as stakeholders as opposed to rights holders, reliance on Indian as a social construct to guide decision making, a certainty in Indigenous pathology, encouraging Indigenous participation in local institutions, which was just another way of saying please assimilate into our processes, and ultimately abandon your indigeneity. As a caveat, each municipality bases their exclusion formula on the nation-state's Indigenous policy-making models. Nevertheless, in this instance, a large metropolitan center and a smaller municipality demonstrate significant parallels. We are witnessing history repeating itself as we pursue reconciliation to try and alleviate existing tensions traceable to the same institutional forces that continue to operate unabated. Arguably, we now practice benign neglect, having transcended our era of calculated neglect. What is perhaps most disturbing is that the issues currently undermining reconciliation efforts are the very issues reconciliation should be tackling. Redefinition of terms is needed, but municipal reflection of what drives official attitudes resulting in ongoing political segregation demand attention. In an age of urban Indigenous population growth, municipal social sustainability is dependent on rectifying these oversights. Thank you.